Good afternoon. Today we have another webinar in our Lessons from the Field series where advocacy leaders and other experts share their experiences, including failures and challenges and opportunities. And thanks so much for joining us today. Today, the topic of conversation is the National Birth Defect Registry, and presenting is Betty McDessie. I think I botched it.
That's okay. McDessie.
McDessie, so sorry. She's the founder and director of Birth Defect Research for Children, and will share a little bit in the next 30 minutes about their registry. Betty, thank you so much for doing this for us today. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vilma. I appreciate it. Why my child? It's the question every parent asks when their child is born or later diagnosed with a birth defect. It's the question that we ask when our son was born with most of his right hand missing and other birth defects. The National Birth Defect Registry is the culmination of our search for answers for ourselves and for other families. I'd like to start my presentation with a short video that discusses the development of the registry.
50,000 babies are born with major birth defects, and even when babies seem okay at birth, they may have problems as they grow older. Every family asks, why? Why did this happen to my child? This is why Birth Defect Research for Children created the National Birth Defect Registry, a research project designed by 7 scientists to look for the causes of birth defects. The registry is online, so you can enter your child's case anytime, night or day. Data from the registry is analyzed to find patterns of birth defects associated with similar exposures, like missing limbs in children whose mothers took a morning sickness medication, and cleft palates in a Tennessee community where solvents leaked into the water supply, or birth defects in the children of veterans who were exposed to chemicals in the Vietnam or Gulf Wars. Data from the registry has also uncovered important clues to autistic spectrum disorders. Registry data has been used for studies presented to government agencies and in national media forums. The Director of Research and Development for the EPA wrote, "Your birth defects registry is the type of effort needed to make linkage between environmental exposures and birth defects." Visit the National Birth Defect Registry at www.birthdefects.org. This video was supported by a grant from the American Legion Child Welfare Foundation.
For approximately 20 years, I have been the co-chair of a committee, well, it's actually called a group called Partners. It's the Committee of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And Partners represents major disease or health groups like breast cancer, learning disabilities, autism, birth defects, autoimmune disease. We get research from NIEHS twice a month. In fact, that's my job to send it out. But we also get to meet with a director once a year to bring up any concerns we have. The reason these groups were selected is because all of these groups, there is research showing that certain environmental exposures may play a part in the conditions. So I don't even remember what year it was, but not so long ago, I made a presentation to the NIHS about how the registry works, which really goes into the concept behind it. And this is a PowerPoint, which I'll just talk through. Basically, the registry it's based on the concept of the alert practitioner. And what that means is really the major external causes of birth defects. Now, I'm not talking about autosomal dominant or recessive. I'm talking about things like drugs, chemicals, radiation, even viruses. These were first developed by the alert practitioner. These were doctors or researchers working with groups of children, and they started to notice usually a very rare birth defect to start and do some retrospective analysis looking for something in common in those cases. The alert practitioner identifies patterns of birth defects with the same or similar exposures. Our birth defect registry does the same thing. We collect data on maternal and paternal exposures. We are the only registry in the world that I know of collecting data on what the father did. And I can talk about that a little more. Our cases are duly identified by individual symptoms as well as overall syndrome or category name. We don't use ICD-9 or ICD-10 codes because these miss a lot of birth defects. When I mentioned a minute ago that the major external causes or teratogens were first identified through this mechanism, that includes the effects of thalidomide, which causes children with phocomelia, little flipper limbs, the rubella virus, dilantin, DES, fetal alcohol syndrome, methylmercury, radiation, Accutane. I could go on and on. All were identified this way, not by cohort studies, not even by case control studies, because until you have a hypothesis, you don't really know what to do a case control study. Now, when you have a new idea, back in probably late 1980s, I was very frustrated with birth defect research and said, we're not getting anywhere. And I thought, well, how have the connections been made between external exposures and birth defects? And that's when I settled on the alert practitioner idea. So we had the concept of creating a national interrelational database that would collect data from all over the country, all kinds of exposures, health, genetic, exposure histories. And in developing the questionnaire, we actually contacted all the states and the CDC and got copies of their registry questionnaires to create ours, and we believe make it better. That's a little egotistical, but we had to have scientists. You can't just have a concept and not have any support for it. So we were able to get a team of top-notch scientists, Dr. Peter Kahn from Rutgers, Dr. James Murthy, University of Colorado, Theo Coburn, who was the mother of the whole endocrine disruptor business, Stuart Newman, New York Medical College, Shauna Swan. Shauna Swan has just written a book called Countdown that she's promoting all over the country about the sperm crisis in our country. Maureen Paul, who was a practicing obstetrician, Waylon Swain. Waylon Swain worked in Times Beach, which was so contaminated with dioxin that the government bought it. Waylon Swain developed a company that helped detoxify land that had been contaminated with things like dioxin. And Dr. Jeanette Sherman, who was an MD who worked on chemical effects of adverse chemical effects, but she also was responsible for finding a cluster of babies with similar effects whose mothers had been exposed to Dursban or chlorpyrifos. And she was responsible for getting that chemical banned from the indoor market in the early 2000s. They have just taken it off the market altogether just within the last few weeks. So she unfortunately has passed away, but she was, her life's work was great. I would like to just discuss a few projects that we've used this concept to evaluate. The first has been Bendectin, the second Agent Orange, third Gulf War, and then I'll just talk about one community-based issue, and that's the Dixon cleft palate cluster. The original registry was developed to be in the format of a scannable test, because we thought everybody who's been through school has filled out a Scantron. Big mistake. What we found is that we had a booklet and we would send them out with the envelope to come back. Well, if an area didn't apply to a family, they just put a big X through it, or let the kids write on it with crayons. You can't run those through a Scantron. So we had to create a mirror database and do data entry from the questionnaires into this mirror database. We have about 4,000 cases that we collected in that way. In 2004, we got a grant to convert the whole project to online, which is so much better because now we are able to add new categories of exposures, new categories of conditions that are starting to come up, improve it. We just completely reprogrammed the database to make it cell phone friendly because many young people of childbearing age don't even have a laptop or a PC. They're doing everything on their mobile phone. So I'll start out with Bendectin. Bendectin is the drug that caused our son's birth defect. It was an anti-nauseant put on the market in 1956. We got it off the market. We got it off the worldwide market in 1982. Bendectin was a combination of an antihistamine, an antispasmodic, and B6. It probably was relatively benign until the DESI amendments. The DESI amendments, drug efficacy safely implementation, required them to prove that it was efficacious as well as safe. Well, it wasn't all that efficacious. So what they did is that it was a drug that had 20 shellac coatings, and it probably wasn't even dissolving in many women, just pass it on through. Well, they removed 10 of the shellac coatings, and then they microprocessed the bentyl antispasmodic, which made it 10 times more potent. Once they did that, case reports started coming in from all over the world of children with limb reduction defects like our sons, only we didn't know about it. As a matter of fact, the doctor who had discovered that thalidomide caused birth defects had reported in 1972 that he thought it was causing limb defects. I didn't take it till 74. So, you know, it was, yeah, they were already on it, but we didn't know. Bentyl has also been associated with sudden infant death syndrome when it was used as a colic syrup. They sent out a warning not to use that. And the antihistamine, doxylamine succinate, has been associated in government studies with childhood cancer. So all the way around, it seems like a benign drug, but it's not. So the signal birth defect, and you're always looking for the signal birth defect when you're using this type of analysis. The signal birth defect was upper limb reductions. What we do is we take all the cases with a particular exposure, divide them to cases per 100, and then all the cases without that exposure, divide those into cases per 100 and compare them. So as you can see, the upper limb reductions are really skewed and nothing else in our database. And believe me, we collect on everything that you can think of and things you probably haven't thought of. And nothing else has that kind of skewing. Absence of the pectoralis muscle. I won't go through all these. It's on our database or on our registry. You can look at them. Pectus excavatum, which is sunken chest, cleft lip and palate, abnormal teeth, hypospadias, sort of, but undescended testicles, and attention disorders, and thyroid defect, which is interesting because the thyroid, as well as early puberty, the thyroid, we know that doxylamine has an effect on thyroid. Now, I'll just insert that the reason that we pursued Bendectin was because people from the FDA, I guess you'd call them whistleblowers, called us when we were inquiring about the drugs I had taken during pregnancy and told us to do this and helped us and sent us information. So it wasn't just, oh, I have a child with a problem, let me go see what I can figure out. It was a very complicated and long story. After Bendectin, we were contacted by the judge who was, or one of his special masters, who was overseeing the Agent Orange litigation, Judge Weinstein. Agent Orange was a defoliant used during the Vietnam War to reduce the jungle to make it safer for the soldiers. So, you know, there was a good idea behind it. They just didn't know how toxic it would be. Agent Orange is comprised of 2 herbicides and the toxic component dioxin. No one ever plans to make dioxin. Dioxin happens when you split the chlorine atom to make certain chlorinated drugs or chemicals. Dioxin targets the immune system, causes ectodermal defects, neurobehavioral defects, thyroid defects, abnormalities of the teeth, and alterations in learning. None of these are traditional birth defects. So when we were developing the section of the registry to collect data on the Vietnam veterans' children, we were working with the New Jersey State Agent Orange Commission. They insisted that we add categories of learning, attention, and immune disorders, immune and endocrine disorders to the database. I argued with them, oh, no, those are not birth defects, and no. Well, now we know that those are considered functional birth defects. When the baby is forming, not only are there little muscles, bones, structures of their body forming, but the systems that are going to run the body are starting to form. The endocrine system, the immunological system, the neurological system, those are all forming. So if something goes awry, you can end up with functional problems, not just structural problems. And as a matter of fact, I would say that today we are looking at many more functional problems than we are pure structural problems. So it was with some surprise after I had argued with them that when we started to collect data, and it has been absolutely true from the first 300 cases compared to about 1,500 non-veteran cases, even up to, this is 1,000 on our website now, we have, I think, 2,000 some odd veterans. It hasn't changed. We find increases in skin disorders of all kinds, and the skin is sort of the window to what's going on in your body. Sorry, just jumped up there. Childhood cancers, neuroblastoma, leukemia. I'm having a little trouble with my mouse, sorry. What in the, there we go. All categories of learning disorders, attention disorders, actually exactly what dioxin is supposed to cause. Emotional behavioral problems, allergic conditions, primary immune problems, endocrine problems related to puberty, diabetes, hypoglycemia, and a range of more non-specific things like endometriosis, menstrual disorders, because these are not babies. These children are in young adulthood. So we're seeing other things that no other registry is collecting because they're not collecting out that far. So working with the veterans, the Vietnam veterans, a law was passed in 2016 that will require the Veterans Administration to study male-mediated birth defects. Now, they're not particularly keen on doing that, so there's going to take some persuasion to get them to meet the letter of the law. About a year after the Gulf War, because we were pretty well known in the military community, we started getting cases of birth defects in the children of Gulf War veterans. So I asked the advisory board, I said, well, should we do a special section to collect data on what we're finding? And they said, oh yes, you're going to get good data because these are babies. We contacted the General Accounting Office and found that there were 31 categories of reproductive toxicants in the Gulf environment. A reproductive toxicant either causes reproductive problems in animals or humans or both. So we've got a lot of pesticides, lead, solvents, you name it, things that we know can certainly be adverse to reproduction. I'm going to skip down a few charts because I want to show you the signal birth defect that we started to find. All of a sudden, we started to find this increase in Goldenhar syndrome. A golden heart syndrome is an asymmetrical face. The eye can be absent on that side, the ear can be absent, loss of hearing. All the internal organs can be on the opposite side. There is a milder form of this where it's just slightly asymmetrical face called hemifacial microsomia, but our cases were very severe. Ultimately, we had about 50 cases in a birth population of 75,000. I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. 50 cases in a birth population of 75,000. Oh, yes. So the Department of Defense, we had quite a bit of publicity for this. The Department of Defense was not particularly happy, so they decided to fund a study at the Naval Training Research Center in San Diego. And they looked at cases born in military hospitals, and they found a tripling. Now, they didn't have access to the cases that were kicked out to civilian hospitals. In the military, if through prenatal testing, they discover you're going to have a child with a problem, they send you out to a place that's going to have a high-tech nursery, better facilities than an average military hospital. They only lacked 2 cases, even with just half the data, to reach statistical significance. So going back up, there were 4 studies then done by VA researchers that found increases in a number of different birth defects in the children of Gulf War veterans. But to date, nothing has been done. Anencephaly, cortical blindness, Dandy Walker. One that interests me a lot, because we had a lot of conversation about this, is hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Hypoplastic left heart syndrome is probably the most serious heart defect. It used to be a death sentence. Now they have staged procedures to help keep the child alive. It's still quite a difficult thing. So this work would fall under the law as well, because the new law covers all military exposures to toxins. And it not only covers them in the children, but now there's indications in the grandchildren. There's a whole new field called translational research, where particularly through the father, these problems are causing, or these exposures are causing epigenetic changes to the sperm. It's not a true DNA inheritance kind of mechanism. It is carried on, and in rodent studies, it can go on through up to 7 generations, which is really scary. Now, there's not much yet done in the human data for obvious reasons. I mean, who wants to find this out? But we are working with Dr. Michael Skinner, who has done some of the seminal work in translational research. And, we may end up doing a study of Vietnam veterans. We'll see. Yeah, we have to raise the money. The registry can also be used for community investigations. We had a call from a grandmother who was referred to us by the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. She had a grandchild with cleft palate, and she ran a daycare. So she just said there were too many cases in her community. Well, you never know. I mean, she may just be sensitized to notice things she never noticed before. But we sent the questionnaires in, and in a very short amount of time, we had 19 cases of cleft palate and less than 1,800 births over a 3-year period. The community was very engaged, and you have to have that to do community-based research. They went into the water department files and found that there was a landfill there that was neither capped nor lined. Adjacent to the landfill was a river. Underneath the landfill was a conduit or stream connecting to the river. The river fed into the main water supply for the well for the community. Over a period of 20 to 30 years, 2 companies there had hauled in barrels of trichloroethylene, or TCE, a solvent, chunked them in the landfill, and over time, these barrels rusted out, and the trichloroethylene mixes with water and forms what's called leachate. Now, the topography of Tennessee isn't like Florida. In Florida, you put something on the sand, it goes right down into the aquifer. In Tennessee, it kind of gathers up in pockets because it's more hard pan. Depending on the rain, depending on the topography, from time to time, this would drift into the main water well. All that these families had in common was drinking from the same water. So I was in Washington presenting at a Children's Environmental Health Conference, and I decided to talk about Dixon. And afterwards, a gentleman introduced himself. He said he was a retired official from the EPA, and he wanted to help us. And he did help us. He got the EPA to come back into Dixon. The CDC came in and confirmed the cluster of cleft palates. The EPA saw to it that the landfill was capped. The state of Tennessee voted to move the water supply away from the river. And that's about as good as it gets. It took us 5 years to do that. We didn't have any special funding, but it was just something that it was so compelling that we decided to do it. So basically, the National Birth Defect Registry can be a tool for birth defect prevention. It can generate hypotheses for further research, and it gives the families a role in research and prevention. You can't possibly know what a family was exposed to unless you ask them. A mother might have gotten a prescription and decided not to take it. Or she might have talked to her neighbor and said, I don't feel so good. Oh, I've got something, why don't you try this? Or maybe they decided to paint the nursery, or maybe they decided that they've got too many ants in the house and they run around and spray with this or that. You're never going to know that unless you ask the family. It is true that self-selected, self-reported data can certainly have errors. You can be confused, you can forget, you can lie, whatever. But if you have enough cases with the same exposure and the same type of birth defect, something's going on. Then you raise the hypothesis. You look at other forms of data. You look at cell culture work. You look at case control work. You look at animal studies to see if there's anything out there supporting what you're finding. Now, we never anticipated doing research studies or studies from our data. We really viewed it as a way to raise an idea, maybe help a community, maybe take it to a regulatory agency. But we actually can do studies from the registry. When we do studies, we do have to get IRB forms signed. We have to get proof of the diagnosis, and just like any other study. So we do have a body of data that can be used for studies, can be used to generate hypotheses, or as I mentioned to you earlier, in the case of the family with cystic hydroma, it can be a way for a family who just wants to know, what are other things are my children going to have? Are these things that I should be looking out for? It's really the ultimate source of exposure information. You're never going to know unless you ask. You're never going to know. It has a relatively low cost of operation. A 10-year case cohort study costs $1 million easy. We can operate 10 years on $1 million. Not easy to come by, mind you, but we can. We do this work because every birth defect has a cause. Everyone. It could be genetic, could be environmental, could be viral, could be nutritional. It has a cause. And if you can find out the causes, then you can work toward prevention, which is the best of all worlds for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty, so much for sharing about, providing some information about your work and your registry and some of your findings. Thanks again.
You're very welcome.